Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 164 and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing the situation in North Korea, which is actually, seemingly getting maybe a little bit better. So if you want to share the news and maybe some good news on this show, think about foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. All right, so North Korea, what's going on there? Well, the South Koreans agreed to talks with the North Koreans and sent some relatively high-level officials to North Korea. I believe something equivalent to like the Director of National Security for South Korea, and I'm not sure if that's like a Homeland Security Director type position or a James Mattis Defense Department type position. Either way is a critical person, as well as the head of their intelligence services. So something equivalent to maybe a Christopher Wray or Mike Pompeo was on this trip. So, some significant people attending here. One of the big announcements was that Kim Jong Un would be attending the talks that were occurring in North Korea's capital, Pyongyang. And it seems that the talks were at least somewhat successful. Coming out of the first day of the talk, and I believe there are 2-day talks, there was an agreement between North and South Korea that I don't know if it was like a handshake or they actually signed something. And that agreement said that both countries agreed to work towards talks between North Korean leader Kim Jong Un and South Korean President Moon, and as well as look for talks between North Korea and the United States. So something I think is very interesting here and that I want to talk about on today's show is that there's always this idea that the United States is kind of the country that goes around the world and makes peace between regional enemies. This, I think, is best exemplified in the Israel-Palestine situation, where everybody pretends that the United States is this maybe not impartial third party, but definitely a very moral and upstanding third party who just wants to see everybody get their fair shake. Which isn't true, but this is definitely the role the United States has assumed and presents themselves in on the world stage. And so here we have a situation with North Korea where the United States is threatening to attack North Korea, and it's the South Koreans that are walking the United States back and saying things like the United States couldn't attack North Korea without, maybe not our permission, but without our knowledge. And here we have a South Korean envoy going to North Korea and making talks. And it's not like the United States is, going and visiting South Korea and seeing what they'll agree to. And then we go and talk to the North and see what they'll agree to and see if we could sit them down and get them to make a deal and shake hands. But you essentially have South Korea playing that role. And so here's a case where it's just so obvious that the American, government, our Pentagon, our army is a world empire. Here we are, we're having the South Koreans trying to talk the Americans out of attacking the North Koreans. It's absolutely insane how the tables turn in this situation. I also want to talk about this because I see this a lot. And the last time I just thought to myself, this is really weird, but I think it's important. And that's the U.S. media and the U.S. government too, but I mainly see this out of the U.S. media labeling the North Koreans as the hermit kingdom, or talking about them as somewhat like this, lone breakaway state that only has isolated itself, I guess is the clearest way to say that. And that, everybody's reaching out to the North Koreans for talks, but, Kim Jong Un just turns them away and he's gonna sit there with his slaves and his money and he's just gonna make nukes. But in reality, the North Koreans have been very open to having talks with the Americans. Now, I'm not saying that the North Koreans were always willing to negotiate in the best faith, or that the North Koreans weren't offering talks with conditions that they knew the United States wasn't going to accept. But at the same time, the North Koreans have extended their hand several times. And if you kind of look at the situation where the North Koreans say, we want nuclear weapons to have a nuclear deterrent, just like the United States has, just like Russia has, just like China has, India, Pakistan, Israel, France, and UK. All these countries, they have nuclear weapons and they, say they're for a nuclear deterrent, and we're being threatened all the time, so we're going to have them for the same reason. But that being said, we'll agree, to have a kind of peace deal with you where we agree not to attack each other. And so I think that's far from the North Koreans being unwilling to talk. Look, Kim Jong Un is not a, madman hermit. He doesn't leave North Korea, but that's because he would be arrested or killed if he left North Korea. At least not without some kind of, very, very important agreement hammered out beforehand. But I think that, again, that adds the portrayal that, Kim Jong Un's a madman. He has an army of slaves. He's, getting rich off their bats, and then he's making nukes to intimidate everyone around him. Well, I think he's certainly a terrible person, who absolutely does use the North Korean people as slaves and as human shield. The United States constantly threatening to attack them is not to protect the North Korean people. We have no interest in the North Korean people in mind. I think a lot of it is just really terrible policy that's led to a situation where North Korea now has nuclear weapons and missiles it could at least threaten the United States with as being a nuclear deterrent. The other news that came out of the peace talks, and kind of getting back to that, and this seems to come out of the second day of talks, and that is South Korea has sent signals to the United States that North Korea, I don't know if the North Koreans told the South Koreans they were willing to negotiate on nukes. That didn't seem explicitly true to me, but it seems like the South Koreans are telling the Americans that the North Koreans are willing to negotiate on their nukes. Now, I think there's some positives and negatives here. The negative, of course, is that if North Korea doesn't end up agreeing to whatever, if the Americans say, well, okay, so North Korea, give up all of your nuclear weapons, then maybe we'll talk. The North Koreans obviously aren't agreed to this, but then you'll have a lot of people like John Bolton throwing their hands up in the air and saying, well, we tried everything we could. They said they were willing to negotiate. We tried to negotiate, and they spurred our negotiation. And so the real North Koreans are really putting this out there. I think it puts them in a little bit of a vulnerable position to the Americans in this sense. In the other way, very positive. If the North Koreans are willing to negotiate on their nukes, well, I hope all countries denuclearize, and if the North Koreans do, that would probably be a good thing. Like you said, my trouble with this is that I don't know if it would happen just because of the examples of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, where Kim Jong Un saw very clearly that these countries told the United States, hey, we don't have weapons of mass destruction, and then they were later killed. But hey, these seem to be, the most positive signs of North Korean peace. I mean, when you have all the negative things coming out of the American side, where you have all these threats of a bloody nose attack, and you have several people really worried that Trump is looking to carry out some kind of strike against North Korea. You have influential thinkers like John Bolton saying, well, I don't know what else we could do. We've tried everything over the past 20-something years, and you just can't deal with these people. And so on the American side, you really have this time running out thing kind of going on. But on the Korean side, it seems like they're really taking steps forward in a positive direction. On the last show, I talked quite a bit about Putin's new missiles, and I just wanted to touch on that a little bit more because I think it's pretty important. I also want to highlight that Putin said that Russia would not be extraditing the 13 people indicted in the Mueller probe. I know on the last show I had talked about how Putin said he wanted to see the evidence. But I mean, these people didn't commit crimes, so I don't, they try to, do clickbaity ads on Facebook and manipulate the algorithms. I don't know what that is, but it certainly doesn't seem like any kind of crime to me. So Justin Raimondo wrote an article that I'll link to in the show notes page titled A New Cold War, and kind of explain how, we're now in a situation where Russia has rebuilt itself from the collapse of the Soviet Union and poses a real nuclear deterrent threat to the United States, especially with their new weaponry. The weaponry is a hypersonic cruise missile that I guess would be able to reach the United States, launch from anywhere on the world, including going over the South Pole. And I guess because, like I was saying on the last show, these cruise missiles fly below altitude, so that makes them able to avoid some of the United States like that missile detection systems. And you also have the development of a Russian, I believe, autonomous submarine, maybe not, remotely controlled submarine that could have nuclear weapons on it, as well as some other technological advances that really put Russia far ahead of America's ability to carry out a first strike. Now, it's important to remember that what we're talking about here is that the United States was very, very close to first strike capabilities, meaning the United States could bomb Russia, wipe them out, or at least wipe them out to the point where the American missile defense systems could clean up whatever minor amount of nuclear weapons that they have left. And in a lot of ways, what we're talking about there is a genocide of the Russian people, right? And so I think at least Putin and a lot of the Russian people have felt very threatened by this. Now, I guess it doesn't seem super likely to me that the United States would carry out a first strike against Russia unprovoked for, any reason. And from my position, the Russians didn't have a whole lot to be afraid of, but that doesn't mean that the Russians are necessarily comfortable with the Americans having first strike capabilities. And you can obviously see why, they wish to have the ability to strike back against the Americans should that come about. And I think this will definitely change some of the ways maybe battles are carried out regionally for Russia, such as Syria, Ukraine, where if the United States did have first strike capabilities, the United States could escalate as far as they want. We're escalating in Ukraine by now giving them Javelin missiles. We've really armed and have announced our long-term stay in Syria, and we continue to threaten Iran. And so maybe this type of move will say, Russia mates the United States that, hey, you can't escalate forever. Yeah, maybe you could bomb Assad here and there, but if this ever got too out of hand, we would be able to nuke some of your cities as well. Whereas now the situation is that, the United States would still probably absolutely carry out a complete genocide. The Russian people should come to nuclear war. However, the Russians would be able to kill an awful lot of Americans as well. And then, there's people that'll make the environmental points that if the United States was really going to nuke Russia to that extent, that it really wouldn't matter who was actually bombed to death because so many people are going to starve to death by the, ensuing environmental damage and whatever. Anyways, generally the important point back to the Raimondo article is this capability puts a situation in place where I think you're going to see some escalation on the part of the Americans when we've already are going to spend $1.2 trillion upgrading our nuclear triad in a new arms race between the United States and Russia, where everybody is holding their breath, hoping that now Trump and Putin don't end up nuking each other. Eric Margolis also wrote a pretty good article on this, linked to in the show notes page. To me, he seemed to focus much more on the regional stuff that I talked about and not necessarily the Cold War. Moving on, I want to talk about the Iran deal because that's a big topic. We just had the APAC conference. I think Netanyahu's visiting the United States. We have Mohammed bin Salman coming to the United States. And so Iran's going to be a big topic in the coming days. Trump administration has talked about how they decertified the Iran nuclear deal. This is a bit of bluster because that really didn't do anything. The big hold your breath moment comes from Trump having to continue to allow the sanctions relief on Iran that are part of the Iran nuclear agreement. He'll have to do that next in May. Now, Trump's main complaint, the ridiculous complaint of the neocons, is that Iran is violating the spirit of the deal with their missile program. Now, I have seen everyone get this wrong. Iran does not have ICBMs. Iran doesn't even have intermediate range ballistic missile. Iran has, I think they call it medium range ballistic missile, which is up to 2,000 kilometers range. This means that, Iran could bomb or launch missiles at India, Russia, Turkey, the very, very corner of Europe. Of course, as you'll hear Mike Pence say, probably on Friday's show, they could bomb every square inch of Israel. Saudi Arabia is also within that range. Now, those missiles are not capable of delivering nuclear warheads. That's also not correct. So I read this really good article that I'll link to in the show notes page, and it explains why Iran doesn't have an ICBM program and isn't developing one. Now, the significance of an ICBM program would then be the United States could say, Iran is either going to launch a ballistic missile over the Pacific or over the Atlantic and hit the United States. So a lot of what they point to when they say that Iran is developing nuclear missiles is Iran's ability to launch satellites. Now, this is a far different industry, and it's really important to economies to be able to launch satellites. So Iran, as part of their space program, has developed rockets that are able to deliver satellites into space. As the article points out, and so if you're really interested, you can read through. But these rockets technology really doesn't help to advance the ballistic missile program. And they use North Korea as an example to kind of explain how North Korea developed a rocket program for their satellites and really didn't use much of this technology towards their ICBM program. So I guess it's important to remember, and there's a lot of reasons why Iran is clearly not developing an ICBM program. They're not testing for it. The technology is very expensive and a long way away from what the Iranians have. The lie they'll try to sell you that this is being advanced with their space program is garbage. And also the Ayatollah of Iran has capped the range of their missiles at 2,000 kilometers, which is the current range. The other note is that if Iran wants targets, the Americans put a lot of targets around Iran. Remember, one border of Iran is Iraq, the other is Afghanistan. The U.S. has 20,000 troops combined. Those two countries, we have aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. We have a base with 10,000 troops in Qatar. And so all of these are within immediate range of Iran, and they wouldn't even need their long-range ballistic missiles to hit the U.S. targets. And so the idea that if Iran wanted to strike the United States, that they would have to develop ICBMs isn't true because American is giving them targets. Story out of Turkey I want to mention, and that is the Turkish government suppressed a women's march using tear gas and arrested 15 of the protesters. I believe one of the articles said that the protesters, or at least a women's march in Turkey, sometimes is kind of hard to tell with the translations, was condemning Turkey's Operation Olive Branch into Syria. That operation continues to gain ground for Turkey, not particularly quickly, but that pace does seem to have increased. Civilians continue to die. We have the White House saying that they're looking at another attack against Assad. I guess this would be for alleged use of chemical weapons by Assad in East Ghouta. Of course, there's no evidence of this. This was admitted by General Mattis. East Ghouta, the Syrian government is now carrying a ground campaign, taking 25% of the rebel-held area there. Since the ground campaign started until Monday, 50 people have been killed. It's really hard to get numbers out of that situation just because there's so many people dying. The fighting's so brutal, urban warfare. The last thing I want to talk about out of Syria is that we have the SDF announcing that they've halted operations against ISIS in order to fight Turkey. And so all this time that the U.S. government has been telling Turkey, trust us, we're not arming the YPG to fight you. They're only going to use those weapons to fight ISIS. Now look, they're going to use them to fight Turkey. Of course, I mean, it's Turkey that is aggressing against the Kurds in this situation. And so I'm not trying to, say, oh, look, I care what Turkey's concerns are or anything like that. So this is just so obvious that the United States was lying and they got caught for it, but they're just going to continue to do it. Last couple things I want to touch on. We have Senator Reid taking a trip to Somalia and admitting that the mission there is not going well. Basically, he said there's kind of three phases to the U.S. mission. One is to disrupt the operations of Al-Shabaab, and the second two are kind of to stabilize and rebuild the areas. And he says, we're able to disrupt Al-Shabaab, but other than that, we're not making any real progress. In Libya, we have the two largest oil fields shut down, cutting off about 400,000 barrels of oil per day from that country. This is significant for a lot of reasons. The main one just being that the Libyan people are in trouble, and any, wealth coming into that country is important. And it just shows, the utter failure of the U.S. intervention there. Oh, I forgot to mention, Patrick Coburn wrote an article related to Syria and Iraq explaining how ISIS was stepping up attacks and carrying out more attacks in those two countries. And this is in part because the enemies of ISIS have finally turned on each other. We have Turkey fighting the Kurds. We have the United States dropping bombs on some Syrian allied forces and Russian mercenaries. In Iraq, we had the Iraqi government kind of turning against the Kurds there. And so it seems like ISIS has been able to take advantage of some of this chaos to carry out attacks. Now, I don't know if ISIS's goal here is just to kind of fold back into an Al-Qaeda style insurgency or actually look to, take some more ground and reform up a caliphate. Not that that would be possible necessarily or anything. Last thing I want to talk about is the Afghan deal. Now, in a recent speech, the president of Afghanistan said that the Afghan government would be willing to engage in talks with the Pashtuns, the Taliban, without necessarily preconditions for the talks, but then he laid out conditions to what the deal would be. And this called for the Taliban to accept certain human rights standards and to basically fold into the Afghani government and recognize the Afghani government. Now, it seems to me that the Taliban are probably going to pass on this deal because I don't know if they necessarily are going to be willing to bend a knee to the Afghan government to end the war. They may be looking for more independence or autonomy, but this is really being billed in the mainstream media, kind of like a North Korea situation that, oh, well, look, we're trying to negotiate with the Taliban, but they're just unreasonable, when that's not necessarily what's happening, and maybe the conditions being laid out as preconditions for the talks just aren't going to be met. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. It's on iTunes and Stitcher. libertarianinstitute.org. New website is immersionnews.com. Check it out. I think y'all will like it. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, and the private Facebook group is Foreign Policy Focus.